Montana Territory, 1885. The twilight shadows stretched long across the rolling plains as Morgan Pierce rode toward the distant lights of Willow Creek. At 26, he'd already seen enough of the world to know one truth above all others. A man survived the frontier by keeping to himself. Trust was a luxury as rare as rainfall in August, and attachment was a weight that could drag a man under. The West had taught him that lesson through blood and fire. His bay gelding, Russet, snorted beneath him as they approached the small settlement. Morgan had been riding for the Rocking T for 3 seasons now, moving cattle between summer and winter pastures, breaking horses, and keeping his history locked away where it belonged. Tonight he was on an errand for the ranch owner, delivering a package of legal papers to the town's only lawyer. Willow Creek wasn't much, a dusty main street with a general store, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a small church, and a smattering of homes and businesses that had sprung up like wildflowers after rain. It wasn't a place to put down roots, just a stopover like everywhere else. Morgan tightened his grip on the leather pouch tucked inside his coat, get in, deliver the papers, spend one night at the hotel, and ride out at first light. That was the plan, that was always the plan. As he dismounted in front of the Willow Creek Hotel, the door to the general store across the street swung open, spilling warm lamplight onto the boardwalk. A young woman emerged, her arms laden with packages. She paused to adjust her load, and in that moment a gust of wind caught her blue calico skirt, billowing it around her slender form. Her honey-blonde hair, partially contained in a loose bun at the nape of her neck, shimmered in the lantern light. Morgan found himself staring, forgetting for a moment about the package in his coat or the horse waiting patiently beside him. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, with a freshness about her that seemed out of place in this hard, unforgiving territory. The wind gusted again, stronger this time, and one of her packages went tumbling. Without thinking, Morgan crossed the street in long strides, snatching up the parcel before it landed in a muddy puddle. "Thank you, sir," she said, a genuine smile lighting up her face as he handed it back to her. Her eyes, Morgan noticed, were the color of cornflowers in summer. "My pleasure, miss," he found himself saying, though pleasantries weren't typically his way. "Penelope Clarke," she offered, shifting her packages to extend a gloved hand. "I'm the new schoolteacher, just arrived last month." Morgan took her hand briefly, feeling strangely disarmed by the direct way she looked at him. "Morgan Pierce. I ride for the Rocking T." "Well, Mr. Pierce, I'm much obliged for the rescue." Her smile widened, revealing a slight dimple in her right cheek. "These are supplies for the schoolhouse. Would you believe the children here had no proper books before I arrived? Just one tattered Bible and an almanac from 1876. Morgan nodded, uncertain how to respond. The way she spoke, with such passion about something as simple as books, struck him as both foreign and strangely compelling. "Do you read much, Mr. Pierce?" she asked, studying him with open curiosity. "Not much call for it on the trail, Miss Clarke," he answered, suddenly aware of his dusty clothes and the 3 days' worth of stubble on his jaw. "That's a shame. Books can take us places our horses cannot." Her eyes twinkled with mischief. "Even a fine-looking horse like yours." Before Morgan could respond, she glanced up at the darkening sky. "I should get these back to the schoolhouse before full dark. Perhaps I'll see you around Willow Creek, Mr. Pierce." With that she was gone, moving down the boardwalk with a determined stride, packages balanced precariously in her arms. Morgan watched her go, struck by the odd feeling that something important had just happened, though he couldn't say what. The next morning, after delivering the legal papers to the attorney's office, Morgan found himself with unexpected time on his hands. The ranch foreman had sent word that he should wait for a reply, which wouldn't be ready until the following day. With nowhere to be and nothing pressing to do, Morgan's feet carried him, almost of their own accord, toward the small white schoolhouse at the edge of town. He told himself he was just curious about the place. He'd never had much schooling himself, having left home at 14 after his parents died of fever. But as he approached the building and heard the clear voice of Penelope Clarke reciting a poem to her students, he knew he was lying to himself. Morgan lingered outside, leaning against a cottonwood tree where he could hear but not be seen. Her voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the words, painting pictures of far-off places and grand adventures. When the children's voices joined hers in recitation, something long dormant stirred in his chest. A memory of his mother teaching him his letters by lamplight, perhaps, or simply the unfamiliar sensation of wanting to be part of something beyond himself. The school day ended with the ringing of a brass bell, and children spilled out into the yard, their laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. Morgan straightened, preparing to leave before he was noticed, but he wasn't quick enough. "Mr. Pierce," Penelope's voice halted him. "Are you checking up on your investment?" Morgan turned, confusion evident on his face. "Ma'am." She approached, the same direct gaze fixed on him. Today she wore a simple dress of soft green that matched the new spring grass. "The book you rescued yesterday, it was a collection of poetry by Lord Tennyson. We were just reading from it." "Just passing by," Morgan said, feeling strangely caught out. "Waiting on some papers in town." "Well, since you're passing by, perhaps you'd like to see what your heroics preserved." She gestured toward the schoolhouse door. "I was just about to have my tea." "There's plenty to share." Morgan knew he should decline. Getting tangled up with the pretty schoolteacher wasn't part of any plan, but something in her open expression made refusal seem impossible. "I suppose I could spare a few minutes." The schoolhouse was a single room with rows of simple desks facing a larger teacher's desk at the front. A pot-bellied stove stood in one corner, and bookshelves, surprisingly well-stocked, lined the back wall. It smelled of chalk dust, wood polish, and something floral that he guessed came from Penelope herself. "How many students do you have?" he asked, removing his hat as she busied herself with a small kettle on the stove. 17, ranging from 6 to 16, she replied. "Though attendance is variable, the older boys are often needed for ranch work, especially as spring roundup approaches." Morgan nodded, understanding all too well the demands of ranch life. "Must be hard to teach with such different ages." "It's a challenge," she admitted, pouring steaming water into a chipped teapot. "But they're eager to learn, most of them. Even the reluctant ones come around eventually." She handed him a mug of tea and gestured to a chair beside her desk. As Morgan sat, he noticed a stack of papers, letters by the look of them, bound with a faded blue ribbon. Penelope followed his gaze and a slight blush colored her cheeks. "My silly correspondence," she said, moving the bundle to a drawer. "Pay it no mind." "Correspondence. Must be nice to get letters way out here." Something flickered across her face, too quick to read. "Oh, these aren't letters I've received. They're ones I've written but never sent." Morgan raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued despite himself. "Never sent seems a waste of good paper." She laughed then, a clear sound that reminded him of spring creeks over stones. "Perhaps, but sometimes writing helps me make sense of things, even if no one reads the words but me." They talked for nearly an hour, as the afternoon light slanted through the schoolhouse windows. Penelope told him about growing up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a professor and a mother who championed women's education. She spoke of her decision to come west after her parents' deaths, driven by a desire to bring learning to places that needed it most. "But what about you, Mr. Pierce?" she asked finally. "What brought you to Montana?" Morgan shifted uncomfortably. His past wasn't something he discussed, not even with the men he rode with. "Just following work," he said simply. "Been that way since I was 14. "And your family?" "Gone," the word hung between them, stark and final. Penelope didn't press further, but her eyes held a compassion that made Morgan look away. "Well," she said after a moment, "I'm glad your work brought you to Willow Creek, even if just for a day or two." As Morgan rode out of town the next morning, the attorney's reply secure in his saddlebags, he found himself looking back at Willow Creek with an unfamiliar reluctance. Something about Penelope Clarke's direct gaze and thoughtful questions had wedged itself under his skin, but the feeling would pass, he assured himself. It always did. The spring roundup kept Morgan busy for the next several weeks. Days blurred together in a haze of dust, sweat, and the endless bellowing of cattle. At night, he'd collapse beside the chuck wagon, too exhausted to do more than eat whatever the cook had prepared before falling into dreamless sleep. But sometimes, in those moments between wakefulness and slumber, Penelope's voice would echo in his mind, reciting poetry to children who might never see beyond Montana's vast horizons. And he would wonder about those letters she kept tied with blue ribbon, who she had written them to, and why they remained unsent. It was early June when Morgan found himself riding back into Willow Creek. The ranch owner's wife had asked him to deliver a package to her sister who lived in town, a woman Morgan discovered was the doctor's wife. After making the delivery, he knew he should head straight back to the ranch. Instead, he found himself riding toward the white schoolhouse on the edge of town. The school day had ended, but smoke still curled from the stovepipe. Through the window, Morgan could see Penelope moving about the room, collecting books and straightening desks. He dismounted and tied Russet to the hitching post, his heart beating oddly fast as he approached the door. She looked up at his knock, surprise and something warmer lighting her face. "Mr. Pierce. What brings you back to our little corner of nowhere?" "Delivery for the doc's wife," he said, stepping inside and removing his hat. "Thought I might stop by and see how your scholars are progressing with their poetry." Her smile widened. "They've moved on to mathematics, I'm afraid. Much less romantic, but necessary nonetheless." "Mathematics has its own kind of poetry," Morgan said, surprising himself. "At least, that's what my mother used to say." "She taught school back in Missouri before," he trailed off, startled by the personal admission. "Your mother was a teacher." Penelope set down the books she'd been collecting, her full attention on him now. "You never mentioned that." Morgan shifted uncomfortably. "Not much to tell. She taught in a one-room schoolhouse like this one, died when I was 14. Fever took both my parents within a week of each other." "I'm so sorry, Morgan." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something in the way she said it made his throat tighten. "Long time ago," he managed, "but she would have approved of what you're doing here." Penelope studied him for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Would you like to stay for supper? Nothing fancy, just some stew I keep warming on the stove. I live in the rooms at the back of the schoolhouse, and I rarely have company." Every instinct honed by years of solitary wandering told Morgan to decline, to mount up and ride back to the familiar isolation of the bunkhouse. But instead he heard himself say, "I'd like that very much, Miss Clarke." "Penelope," she corrected with a smile. "If we're to be friends, you should use my given name." "Friends?" The word felt foreign to Morgan, who had acquaintances and working relationships but few he would call by that name. Yet as he followed her through a door at the back of the schoolroom into a small but tidy living space, he found himself wanting exactly that. Penelope's quarters consisted of a combined kitchen and sitting area, with what he presumed was a bedroom through another door. Bookshelves lined the walls here too, filled to bursting with volumes of all sizes. A small desk sat beneath the window, covered with papers and an open journal. As she busied herself with the stew, Morgan noticed the bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon sitting on the corner of her desk. In the daylight, he could see that the top envelope was addressed in a flowing hand. "Mr. Thomas Westfield, Denver, Colorado." Feeling like an intruder, he quickly looked away, but not before Penelope noticed. Her cheeks colored slightly as she brought 2 bowls of steaming stew to the small table. "You caught me," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "My silly letters again." "Didn't mean to pry," Morgan said, genuine regret in his voice. "It's all right," she gestured for him to sit. "It must seem strange, writing letters you never intend to send." Morgan spooned up some of the rich stew, finding it surprisingly good. "I reckon everyone has their ways of making sense of things." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Penelope spoke again. "Thomas Westfield doesn't exist," she said quietly, eyes on her bowl. "I made him up." Morgan paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "The man you write to." She nodded, meeting his gaze with a mix of embarrassment and defiance. "I invented him when I was 16, a perfect gentleman who shared my love of literature and supported my ambitions. I wrote him letters about my dreams, my fears, everything I couldn't say to anyone real. Why not send real letters to real people? Penelope smiled sadly. Who would I write to? My parents are gone. My friends from school married and moved away, and the things I write about, she shook her head. They wouldn't understand my choice to come west to teach in a place like this. But you keep writing to him. This Thomas. Old habits, she said with a small shrug. And perhaps it's easier to be honest with someone who can never judge or disappoint you. Morgan considered this as he finished his stew. There was something both sad and brave about Penelope's imaginary correspondent. How lonely she must have been to create someone to confide in. Yet wasn't that better than closing yourself off entirely, as he had done? After supper, they moved to the small sitting area, where Penelope read aloud from a book of Western tales that one of her students had lent her. Morgan found himself relaxing into the rhythm of her voice, offering occasional corrections about the realities of cowboy life that made her laugh. When he finally rose to leave, the moon was high and bright enough to light his way back to the ranch. At the door, he hesitated, uncertain of the proper way to end such an evening. "Thank you for the meal," he said finally. "And the company." "The pleasure was mine," she replied, her face soft in the lamplight. "Will you come again if your work brings you to town?" Morgan nodded, surprised by how much he wanted exactly that. "I'd like that, Penelope." She smiled at his use of her name. "Safe travels, Morgan." As he rode back under the star-filled sky, Morgan felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with Penelope's stew, and everything to do with the way she looked at him, as if really seeing him. Not just the cowboy, but the man beneath the dust and leather. For the first time in years, Morgan Pierce found himself looking forward to something beyond the next day's work. Over the next 2 months, Morgan found more reasons to ride into Willow Creek than he had in the previous year combined. Sometimes it was legitimate ranch business, mail to post, supplies to order, messages to deliver. Other times, his excuses were flimsy at best, checking on a horse he'd helped break that was sold to the livery stable, or bringing Penelope a book of poetry he'd found in the ranch owner's library, borrowed with permission, of course. Each visit deepened the connection between them. Morgan would arrive at the schoolhouse after the children had gone home, sometimes bearing small gifts, wildflowers picked along the trail or fresh berries he'd found growing by a stream. They would share simple meals and talk long into the evening about everything and nothing. Penelope told him of her dreams for the school, of the children's progress, of the resistance she sometimes faced from parents who saw little use in education beyond basic reading and ciphering. Morgan, in turn, found himself sharing pieces of his past that he'd never spoken aloud. His childhood in Missouri, the devastating loss of his parents, the harsh lessons of survival he'd learned as a boy alone in a man's world. By midsummer, Morgan had to admit to himself what the other hands at the rocking tee had already figured out. He was sweet on the schoolteacher. Their good-natured ribbing when he'd saddle up for another errand to town would have bothered him once. Now he just took it with a half-smile and a shrug. What he couldn't admit, even to himself, was how much the idea of settling down had begun to take root in his mind. For 12 years, he'd drifted from ranch to ranch, never staying more than a season or two, never allowing himself to form attachments. The West was no place for permanence, he'd always believed. A man survived by staying mobile, unencumbered. Yet here he was, lingering at the rocking tee longer than any previous job, all because of a woman with cornflower eyes and a habit of writing letters to a man who didn't exist. It was on a sweltering August afternoon that everything changed. Morgan rode into town on legitimate business. The ranch was selling a string of horses to a buyer from Helena, and Morgan had been sent to finalize the arrangements. After concluding the business, he headed to the schoolhouse, a package tucked in his saddlebag, a special edition of Tennyson's poems he'd ordered from a bookseller in Bozeman. As he approached the familiar white building, he noticed something was wrong. School should have been in session, but no children's voices carried on the still, hot air. The door stood ajar, and when Morgan dismounted and stepped inside, he found the room empty, chairs overturned as if the children had left in a hurry. Penelope, he called, a knot of worry forming in his stomach. A sound from her quarters at the back drew him forward. He found her sitting at her desk, face pale, a telegram clutched in her trembling hands. "Penelope, what's happened?" He crossed to her side, alarm growing at her expression. "The school," she whispered, looking up at him with shock-filled eyes. "They're closing it down." Morgan knelt beside her chair. "What? Why?" She handed him the telegram. It was from the Territorial Superintendent of Education, informing her that due to budget constraints and low attendance records, the Willow Creek school would close at the end of the month. Her position was being eliminated. "There's more," she said, voice hollow. "I've spoken with the parents. Many have decided not to send their children for the remaining weeks. They say there's no point with harvest coming and the school closing anyway." Morgan felt anger rise in his chest. "That's not right. These children need an education." "Do they?" Penelope stood suddenly, moving to the window. "Perhaps they're right. What good has my year here done? Most of these children will never leave Montana. They'll work the same ranches and farms their parents do. What use is poetry to them, or history or geography?" "You don't believe that," Morgan said firmly. "I've heard you talk about the importance of learning, of broadening horizons." She turned to face him, tears welling in her eyes. "What I believe doesn't matter. The territory has spoken. The school will close and she swallowed hard, I will have to return east. My aunt in Boston has offered me a place to stay until I can find another teaching position." The words hit Morgan like a physical blow. "You're leaving?" "What choice do I have? There's no other school within 100 miles that needs a teacher." Morgan couldn't find words. The thought of Penelope leaving, of Willow Creek without her presence, created a hollow feeling in his chest he hadn't experienced since his parents died. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I know we've become friends. I'll miss our conversations." Friends, the word fell far short of what Morgan felt for Penelope Clarke, he realized with sudden clarity. But what right did a saddled tramp like him have to ask for more? He had nothing to offer her, no home, no security, no future beyond the next season's work. "When will you go?" he asked, voice rough. "The stage leaves at the end of the month, August 28th. She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "At least I have time to say proper goodbyes." Morgan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He wanted to rage against the unfairness, to promise her he could fix this somehow. But he was just a cowboy with calloused hands and empty pockets. What could he possibly do? "I should go," he said finally. "Let you make your arrangements." Hurt flickered across her face at his withdrawal, but she nodded. "Of course, you have your own work to attend to." Morgan paused at the door, nearly turning back, nearly speaking the words that pressed against his throat. But in the end, he simply placed his hat on his head and walked out into the merciless summer sun. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of work and sleepless nights. Morgan threw himself into ranch duties with a ferocity that had the other hands giving him a wide berth. He volunteered for the hardest, most isolated tasks, riding fence lines in the far pastures, tracking down strays in the foothills, anything to keep his mind occupied and his body exhausted. He didn't return to town. What was the point? Penelope was leaving. The life he'd started to imagine, a future with roots and purpose, was evaporating like morning dew under the August sun. It was during one of these solitary rides, checking a remote line shack in the mountains, that a summer thunderstorm caught Morgan unaware. The rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the trail into a slurry of mud. Russet stumbled on the treacherous ground, and Morgan, distracted by his troubled thoughts, wasn't prepared. He found himself thrown from the saddle, landing hard on the rocky slope. Pain lanced through his leg as he tried to stand. Broken, he realized with grim certainty, miles from anywhere in a worsening storm with night coming on. Morgan managed to catch Russet before the horse could bolt, but there was no way he could mount with his injured leg. Using the reins as a makeshift crutch, he began the slow, agonizing process of making his way to the line shack he'd been heading for. It took hours. By the time the small, crude cabin came into view, darkness had fallen and Morgan was soaked to the skin, shivering with cold and shock. He barely made it through the door before collapsing onto the dirt floor. As consciousness faded, his thoughts turned not to his predicament or the very real possibility that he might die here, but to Penelope. To her smile, her voice reading poetry, the way she looked at him as if he mattered. His last coherent thought before darkness claimed him was of regret, not for his current situation, but for all the words he'd left unspoken. Morgan drifted in and out of consciousness for what seemed like days. Fever gripped him, bringing with it vivid dreams and hallucinations. Sometimes he thought he was a boy again in Missouri, other times he was riding endless plains under starlit skies. But most often he dreamed of Penelope, reading to her students, writing her letters by lamplight, looking up at him with those clear blue eyes that saw straight through his carefully constructed walls. When he finally woke fully, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's single grimy window. How long had he been here? The storm had passed, but his leg throbbed with dull, persistent pain. He'd managed to splint it during a period of lucidity, using pieces of a broken chair he'd found in the cabin, but he knew the break was bad. Morgan took stock of his situation. He had Russet, who was thankfully still tethered outside. There were minimal supplies in the cabin, some jerky, matches, a canteen that he'd filled during the storm. Enough to keep him alive, but not for long. And no one at the ranch would think to look for him here for days yet. He wasn't expected back until the end of the week. With grim determination, Morgan fashioned a better crutch from a broken shovel handle and managed to get himself outside. It took every ounce of his strength to mount Russet, and the pain nearly made him pass out again. But he knew staying here meant certain death. His only hope was to try to make it back to the ranch, or at least close enough to the trail that someone might find him. The journey was a blur of agony. Morgan clung to consciousness through sheer force of will, focusing on one landmark at a time, that distinctive pine, the creek crossing, the lightning-struck tree. By the time he saw the smoke from the ranch's chimneys in the distance, he was barely staying upright in the saddle. He never felt himself fall. One moment he was urging Russet forward toward safety. The next, he was looking up at the concerned faces of the ranch hands as they clustered around him where he'd fallen. "Morgan, Christ, man, what happened to you? Get the doc from town. His legs busted bad, look at that angle." Their voices faded in and out as they lifted him onto an improvised stretcher. His last thought before unconsciousness claimed him again was that at least he might see Penelope one more time before she left, even if it was just to say goodbye. Morgan woke to unfamiliar surroundings, a clean, simply furnished room with white curtains stirring in a gentle breeze. For a moment he thought he must have died, but the throbbing pain in his leg quickly disabused him of that notion. "You're awake." The voice drew his attention to a chair beside the bed, where Penelope sat, a book open in her lap. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, but to Morgan, she had never been more beautiful. "Where am I?" His voice came out as a croak, his throat parched from fever and thirst. She immediately reached for a glass of water on the bedside table, helping him lift his head to drink. "You're at Dr. Hamilton's house. They brought you in 4 days ago, half dead from fever and with your leg broken in 2 places." 4 days, Morgan struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "But you, the stage." "I didn't leave," she said simply, setting the glass down. "How could I with you lying here at death's door?" Relief washed over him, followed immediately by guilt. "You missed your stage because of me." "There will be other stages." She reached out hesitantly, then seemed to gather her courage and took his hand in hers. "The doctor says you were lucky. If you'd been found even a day later, you might have lost the leg. As it is, you'll heal, though it will take time." Morgan looked down at their joined hands, his rough and calloused, hers smaller but strong in their own way. "I'm sorry," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for, causing her to miss her departure or something deeper. "For what?" she asked, tilting her head. "For nearly getting yourself killed riding alone in a storm." "Yes, you should be sorry for that foolishness." Despite everything, Morgan felt a smile tug at his lips. "Yes, ma'am." Her expression softened. "Why didn't you come back to town, Morgan?" "After you learned I was leaving." He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. What was there to say? You have to go where there's work. I understand that better than most. So you just decided to disappear. Without even saying goodbye. The hurt in her voice made him look back at her. I'm not good at goodbyes, he admitted. Never have been, and He trailed off, unsure how to express the tumult of feelings that had driven him into the mountains. Penelope released his hand and stood, moving to the window. For a long moment she stood with her back to him, looking out at whatever view the window afforded. When she turned back, her expression was resolute. While you were unconscious, she said quietly, you called for me over and over. You said things. She paused, a blush coloring her cheeks. Things I don't think you would have said if you were awake. Morgan felt heat rise in his own face, though he had no memory of what he might have said during his fever. Penelope, No, let me finish, she interrupted. After the second day of sitting by your bedside, listening to you call my name, I did something I've never done before. She moved to the bedside table and picked up something Morgan hadn't noticed, the bundle of blue-ribboned letters. I wrote a letter to a real man. She untied the ribbon and extracted an envelope from the middle of the stack. Unlike the others, this one bore no name or address. She held it out to him. What's this? He asked, not taking it. What I couldn't say out loud, she replied simply. Please read it, Morgan. If you still want me to leave afterward, I'll go on the next stage without argument. Slowly, Morgan took the envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it and withdrew a single sheet of paper covered in Penelope's flowing script. As he began to read, her words seemed to leap from the page directly into his heart. Dear Morgan, it began. I find myself facing departure from Willow Creek with a heavier heart than I could have imagined when I arrived here a year ago. Not because I've failed in my mission to bring education to this remote place, though perhaps I have, but because leaving means leaving you. For years, I've written letters to an imaginary man who could understand my dreams and share my passions. I created Thomas Westfield because I believed such a man couldn't exist in reality, that no real person could see me so completely and value what he saw. How wrong I was. In you, I've found someone who listens not just with his ears but with his heart, who values knowledge not for status but for its own sake, who sees the beauty in words and ideas even though his own life has been shaped by action and necessity. I don't know if you feel even a fraction of what I feel for you. Perhaps your kindness has simply been that of a good man to a lonely woman. But as I prepare to leave, I find I cannot go without telling you that you have become more important to me than any imaginary correspondent could ever be. I believe I am falling in love with you, Morgan Pierce, and if there is any chance that you might someday return those feelings, I would tear up my stage ticket and find a way to stay in this dusty, difficult, beautiful place. Because any place where you are feels more like home than anywhere I've been since my parents died. If I've presumed too much, please forgive me. Consider this letter unwritten and let us part as the friends we have been. But if by some miracle you feel as I do, know that I am waiting for your word. With all my heart, Penelope. Morgan looked up from the letter to find Penelope watching him anxiously, her hands clasped tightly before her. For a moment he couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotions he'd spent years denying himself. When did you write this? He asked finally, his voice rough. The night before you were brought in, she answered. I was planning to give it to you before I left, but then, she gestured to his injured state. Morgan carefully folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope. You're wrong about one thing, he said. Penelope's face fell and she took a step back. I see, I'm sorry for. No, Morgan interrupted, reaching for her hand. You're wrong that I might someday return your feelings. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue despite the fear clawing at his throat. I already do, Penelope, have for months now. Her eyes widened. You do? Why do you think I kept finding reasons to come to town? Why do you think I rode out in a storm rather than face saying goodbye to you? He tightened his grip on her hand. I've spent 12 years believing the West is no place for putting down roots, that caring for someone just means more pain when they're gone. But you've made me question everything I thought I knew. Tears welled in Penelope's eyes, but her smile was radiant. Morgan Pierce, are you saying you love me too? I'm saying I love you, he confirmed, the words feeling both terrifying and absolutely right. And I'm asking you not to get on that stage, not because I'm laid up with a broken leg, but because I want a chance to build something with you. Something permanent. Penelope sat on the edge of the bed, bringing her face close to his. What about the school closing? What about your job at the ranch? Morgan reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. We'll figure it out together. Maybe we can convince the town to keep the school open. Or maybe we'll go somewhere else where they need a teacher. I can cowboy anywhere there's cattle. You'd leave the rocking tea for me? She asked, wonder in her voice. I'd leave everything I've known for you, he answered honestly. But I'm hoping we can find a way to stay, this place. It feels like it could be home, first time I've felt that way since Missouri. Penelope leaned forward until her forehead rested against his. I don't need those letters anymore, she whispered. The ones to Thomas, I have someone real to talk to now. Good, Morgan murmured, lifting his hand to cup her cheek. Because I plan on being around to listen for a very long time. When their lips finally met, it felt to Morgan like coming home after the longest ride of his life. All the miles, all the years of wandering had led him here, to this woman who had written love letters to a man who never existed, only to find that the real thing was sitting across from her at her kitchen table all along. 3 months later, on a crisp November morning, Morgan stood before the newly rebuilt schoolhouse, watching as Penelope pinned a notice to the door. His leg, though still stiff, had healed well enough for him to walk without a cane most days. Beside him stood William Tucker, owner of the Rocking Tea, and several other prominent citizens of Willow Creek. There, Penelope said, stepping back to admire her handiwork, official as can be. The notice announced the reopening of the Willow Creek School, now independently funded by local ranchers and businesses rather than the territorial government. Below that was a second announcement, one that made Morgan's chest swell with pride every time he read it. The citizens of Willow Creek are cordially invited to witness the marriage of Miss Penelope Clarke and Mr. Morgan Pierce, to be held at the Willow Creek Church on December 24, 1885, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Reception to follow at the schoolhouse. William Tucker clapped Morgan on the shoulder. Never thought I'd see the day you'd settle down, Pierce. Always figured you for a drifter. Morgan smiled, his eyes on Penelope as she chatted animatedly with the doctor's wife about wedding preparations. Found something worth staying for, he said simply. The rancher nodded approvingly. That foreman's cabin I offered you, it needs work, but it should make a fine home for you too. Close enough to the ranch for your duties, but private-like for a newly married couple. We appreciate it, sir. I'll have it fixed up proper before the wedding. As the group dispersed, Morgan moved to Penelope's side, slipping his arm around her waist. She leaned into him, a contented sigh escaping her lips. Happy, he asked, though he could see the answer in her eyes. Deliriously, she confirmed, though I still have so much to do before the school reopens. And the wedding planning, your mother's ring needs to be resized, and I still haven't decided on a dress pattern. Morgan silenced her with a kiss, earning them a scandalized, "Well, I never," from the passing church organist. When they parted, both laughing, he reached into his coat pocket. I have something for you, he said, withdrawing a small package wrapped in brown paper, an early wedding gift. Curious, Penelope unwrapped it to reveal a leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with a simple but elegant floral design. Oh, Morgan, it's beautiful, she breathed, running her fingers over the soft leather. Figured you might need a new place for your thoughts, he explained, since you don't need to write to Thomas anymore. Her smile was radiant as she looked up at him. Perhaps I'll write our story instead. How a wandering cowboy found the letter she wrote to a man who never existed and became the very real man she'd been looking for all along. Morgan pulled her close, marveling at how this one woman had changed everything he thought he knew about life on the frontier. I'd like to read that story someday, he said softly. You're living it, my love, Penelope replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him again. We both are. As the first snowflakes of winter began to fall around them, Morgan Pierce held tight to the woman who had taught him that even in the harsh, unforgiving West, there was room for tenderness, for connection, for love. The solitary trail he'd ridden for so long had led him here, not to another temporary stopping place, but to a home and a future brighter than any he could have imagined. And he wouldn't have it any other way.